Hello again, friends. We are back here with our final installment of the Introduction to Bourbon series. Although, I should say, somebody has proposed an interesting idea, one of these about sourced bourbon, so there might be a seventh. I'm not sure yet whether I've got my thoughts composed about sourced whiskey, which we will know is a bugaboo of mine. But let's start from the start. We've been through the history of whiskey, and again, this was adapted from a tasting that I ran for a group of folks who were whiskey enthusiasts, but were bourbon novices, and to try to connect some of that general knowledge they had about whiskey to the specifics of bourbon, and with reference to what are you going to find on the shelf. If you go pick up a bottle, what does that mean, and how does that taste, and why? And again, so much of this is steeped in history and tradition and regulation. And so we've talked about the history of whiskey and bourbon. We've talked about the Bottled and Bond Act, talked about some of the various formats you're going to see. So barrel proof, single barrel, talk about sweet versus sour mash. And if you haven't had a chance to check out those videos, I'd encourage you to do so. They're all up on YouTube. And so we're going to be concluding today with a whiskey that is a favorite of many, and this is Booker's Bourbon. And this is batch 2016-04, so the last batch of that year. This is named for Booker Noe, now deceased, who was the sixth generation descendant of Jacob Beam, who started what is now Jim Beam, and biggest Kentucky straight bourbon whiskey brand in the world. And it is a name that will probably be familiar to you all. And his son is currently Fred Noe is currently the master distiller there, so keeping on a nice family tradition. But Booker himself launched this whiskey in 1988, and you know the thing about this is that is reportedly how he liked to make and drink whiskey. So Beam gives us a frankly ridiculous amount of detail on each batch of this. So we find out which warehouses it came from, which floors, what percentage from each floor. And they release 4 batches a year, each with a kind of a cute nickname. So this is, you can see here, this is the Bluegill Creek batch. And there's a little story about each of these, and it might relate to the fact that Booker liked to smoke country ham, or that there was somebody he had a close relationship with at the distillery, so they named a batch after her or after him. And it's just a really, by reading all these stories and it sort of creates this pointillist portrait of Booker, and you just get a sense of what an amazing guy he was, what a special person, and just a larger than life figure. And I've just actually noticed here they say Booker Noe, his signature's on the bottle, master distiller 1960 to 1992. So 30 years of doing what he did at Jim Beam. So this carries an age statement of 6 years, 5 months, and 28 days, very specific. Now, not all the barrels in the batch will be specifically that old, but the regulations state that has to be the age of the youngest whiskey, so the most junior barrel in the batch will be about that old. And that gets into this interesting question of age, which we haven't yet covered, but how old should bourbon be? So if you're used to drinking Scotch whiskey, you're accustomed to seeing 10 to 12 years of age as it's a minimum, it's table stakes, right? And then you get into 18 years old or 20 or 30 or even 40 years old, right? Now compare that to bourbon, where the oldest that you see is about 23 years. I've had a 24-year-old bottle in the basement, but that is a rarity and an outlier. But a fair deal of it comes to us at more of a kind of a mid to high single digits age range, right? 8 years, 9 years, 10 years. Why is that? Chemistry, baby. It is the process of maturation, and I'm not a chemist by training, but I do remember a little bit from high school chemistry class. So this should be easy for everybody to follow. But the process of maturation is the whiskey gets hotter, right? So in time, summer temperatures rise. The whiskey gets hotter, it expands, it enters the wood of the barrel, and then it cools, and some of that whiskey flows out of the wood. And during this process, there are chemical reactions taking place that give the whiskey its flavor and its color. Now, bourbon is matured, as we know from the law, in new charred oak barrels, which impart a much stronger flavor than a used barrel would. But that's okay, because the bourbon can handle it to a point. And as I said, it's also matured in Kentucky, and Kentucky's hotter than Scotland. Scotland is temperate with a narrower range of temperatures. So those reactions that take a decade or more in Scotland in a huge ex-sherry butt occur more rapidly in Kentucky in a smaller sized bourbon barrel. And so we have bourbon that is aged not as long, but I think you'll find is just as flavorful as Scotch whiskey that's aged for significantly longer. But Booker's is an example of he was a person that said, I like 8-year-old whiskey. I like 6-year-old whiskey. Jimmy Russell is famous for if he had his way, he would make 8-year-old Wild Turkey 101, and that's it, right? He doesn't think that you need 2 decades in the barrel. And I'll tell you what, you can taste, if you get the opportunity to taste some of these rare or harder to find whiskeys, bourbon whiskeys that are in the 20+ year age range. Like, it's very easy for them to start getting overwhelmed by oak, and even some like the Knob Creek picks, again from Jim Beam, that came out last year, were in the 15-year age range, and like some of those to me didn't taste as good as stuff that I've had that was 12 years old or 10 years old. So age ain't nothing but a number, and it's worth keeping that in mind. And again, particularly if you're a person that's used to Scotch whiskey, you might think, well, how could a 6-year-old whiskey be any good or flavorful? And if you've had the chance to try Booker's, it is very good and very flavorful. And another part of that is that this is, of the whiskeys I've shown you, I believe this is the highest proof one so far. So 64% ABV. As I said, the whiskey by law cannot enter the barrel at higher than 65.2%, so 125 proof. No, sorry, I've gotten that backwards. 62.5%, which is 125 proof. I swear I can do basic division. But the lowest barrel entry proof of the ones we've talked about so far was Peerless at 107, Maker's was 110, Wild Turkey was 114, and Four Roses is 120, I believe. So Booker's is 125 proof, the highest of the bunch, along with the Evan Williams that we had discussed. And the thing to be aware of is that water and alcohol evaporate at different rates depending on temperature and humidity. So barrels that are in the cooler parts of the warehouse will be lower proof typically. Those from the center of the warehouse and on higher floors where it tends to be hotter because heat rises, again, high school chemistry here, will be higher proof. And that is because more water than alcohol evaporates under those conditions. So that change can be dramatic from barrel entry proof. So, Buffalo Trace has released bottles of George T. Stagg whiskey north of 140 proof or 70% ABV. And that stuff is really no joke. If you've had it, it is intense. So, if you try this, I'd encourage you trying it at the beginning at barrel proof. For some of you that have preference for, again, if you're used to Scotch whiskey at lower proof, that might seem overwhelmingly hot. Like, take a sip and then take a dropper full of water and add a little couple drops or a splash of water in there and see if that doesn't change it. And that's a really interesting experiment to do. You could go around and find barrel proof whiskeys. So again, Rare Breed that we just talked about, you could find Elijah Craig barrel proof. You could find Maker's Cask Strength. I showed you that bottle before, and then this Booker's, and taste them against each other and see where do you personally like it. A lot of people come out around like 50%. That seems to be a great level. And again, back to tradition. Why was bottled and bond whiskey bottled at 50%? Well, it was just like thought to be a good solid strength for whiskey, an appropriate strength for whiskey. So something to think about. And again, something that the one thing I want to make clear as we get to kind of the end of the series, and I hope you've enjoyed it, and I hope you learned a thing or two, and thought this was useful. But really, whiskey is about you and your relationship to it, and you sharing it with other people. And don't drink something just because I told you to. I mean, I'm happy to give recommendations, but if you try something that I like and you don't, vive la différence, right? This is all about just enjoying yourself and tasting widely and trying to figure out what revs your engine. So do that. Let me know what you think. Again, happy to answer questions, happy to take comments, and I may be back with another one of these depending on if I can muster the gumption to face talking about sourced whiskey. But for now, I'm going to leave it here and just want to say once again, thank you guys so much. This has been super fun to do. I hope it was helpful to you. Please let's use this as the springboard for future engagement. And if I can ever be of assistance to anybody out there, please don't hesitate to reach out and let me know. Appreciate it. Thank you guys so much. Cheers.